The fabric tore, and with that sound, everything changed. Malachi Brookie was standing waist-deep in a river that was trying to kill him, and in his hands he held the shredded pieces of a woman's dress. She was alive. He'd made sure of that. He'd pulled her from the churning, muddy water and dragged her to the safety of the bank. But the woman wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was staring at him with pure, undiluted terror. And up on the ridge, silhouetted against a sky bruised purple with storm clouds, were the men who had seen him do it. They saw a white man, a stranger, holding the torn pieces of their sister's clothing while she scrambled away from him in fear. They saw a crime. They couldn't see the truth. The rain fell like nails on the brim of his hat. In his world, you saved a life, you got a thank you. A torn dress was a cheap price to pay for a lungful of air, but this wasn't his world. He was beginning to understand that with a cold, sinking dread. Just 3 hours earlier, Malachi had been a simple rancher looking for a few stray cattle. The storm had come out of nowhere, a black wave of wind and rain that turned the sky to midnight at 3 in the afternoon. Any sensible man would have turned back, found shelter, and waited for the devil's own temper to pass. But Malachi wasn't sensible, not when he heard the screaming. It wasn't an animal. He knew the sounds of the wild, the cry of a mountain lion, the panicked squeal of a rabbit. This was human. It was a sound of absolute terror, a sound that sliced through the roar of the wind and found a place deep in his bones. He spurred his horse, forgetting the cattle, forgetting the storm, forgetting everything but that sound. He followed it down a treacherous, rocky slope to the creek, a creek that was usually so calm you could step across it. Now it was a monster, a brown, roaring beast, and in its teeth it had a woman. She was caught in the current, her long black hair fanned out around her like a shroud, her traditional dress, now heavy as stone, pulling her under. She was fighting, kicking, clawing at the water, but it was a battle she was about to lose. Downstream, the rapids waited like a set of jagged teeth, ready to chew her up and spit her out. Malachi didn't think. He just moved. He launched himself from his horse, hitting the shockingly cold water with a gasp. The current grabbed him instantly, trying to drag him down to the same fate. But Malachi was built of whipcord and stubbornness. A life of ranch work had made him strong. He fought his way to her, reaching her just as her struggles began to weaken. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, he saw more than just the fear of drowning. He saw fear of him, fear of a stranger's touch, fear of what this rescue might cost her. There was no time for gentle introductions. The rapids were getting closer, their roar growing louder. Hesitation was death. He wrapped a powerful arm around her waist, his fingers bunching the heavy, wet fabric of her dress. He kicked for the shore, fighting a current that felt like a living thing trying to rip her away from him. He heard the fabric strain. Then he heard it tear. The sound was lost in the storm, but he felt it in his hands. He felt her sharp intake of breath, a gasp that was part pain, part shock. But he got them to the shore. They were alive. He'd done the right thing. That's what he thought. Until he looked up and saw the faces in the trees. The warriors on the ridge were like statues carved from the storm itself, dark, silent, and menacing. From where they stood, the story was simple, and it was ugly. They saw the white man. They saw their kinswoman, her dress torn, backing away from him like a cornered animal. They saw the proof of his guilt floating away on the current. The woman, Ayanna, pressed herself against the muddy bank, her eyes darting from Malachi to the figures above. Words poured from her lips in her native tongue, fast and desperate. Malachi couldn't understand a single one, but he understood the panic that fueled them. "I was just trying to help," he said, his voice quiet, holding his hands up to show they were empty. His words only made it worse. She shook her head, a violent, frantic motion, pointing up at the warriors. Then she did something that made no sense at all. She scooped up a handful of wet mud and began smearing it on her arms, her face, as if trying to cover something up, as if trying to erase the evidence of his touch. A war cry split the air. It was a raw, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very throat of the canyon. It was answered by another, and then another, from all directions. They were surrounded. Malachi had heard stories around campfires, tales of clashes on the frontier. He'd never felt the cold, primal fear of it himself, the feeling of being the nail about to meet 100 hammers. Suddenly, Ayanna grabbed his arm. Her grip was like iron. He thought for a second she was seeking his protection, pulling him close. He was wrong. She shoved him, hard, sending him stumbling back into the shallows of the raging river. "Go!" she hissed, the single English word thick with her accent. "They will kill you." But it was already too late. The first warrior was coming down the canyon wall, moving with an unnatural, fluid grace over the slick rocks. Then another, and another, a cascade of silent armed men descending upon them. Malachi counted 12, then lost count as more emerged from the rain-soaked woods. They carried bows, heavy war clubs, and blades that drank the gray light of the storm. Their faces were painted for war. Their eyes promised nothing but violence. The leader reached the riverbank and stepped into the water without pausing. He was a mountain of a man, with muscles forged from a life of conflict and graying hair braided with beads and feathers. His eyes locked onto Malachi, and the hatred in that gaze was so powerful it felt like a physical blow. He spoke, and though the words were foreign, the meaning was universal. This was a sentencing. The verdict was already in. Guilty. Ayanna threw herself between them, her voice a desperate, pleading torrent. But the warrior's face didn't soften. If anything, the sight of her torn dress, the mud on her skin, only seemed to stoke the furnace of his rage. More warriors waded into the river, forming a loose, inescapable circle around Malachi. Their weapons were low, but they were ready. They were just waiting for the word. Malachi understood with sickening clarity. Everything he had done, every ounce of strength he had used to save her life, had been twisted into something monstrous. The torn fabric was his confession. Her fear was his motive. The struggle against the river was seen as a struggle against him. And the most damning piece of evidence was still clutched in his hand, a piece of her sacred dress, an accusation he could not deny. The lead warrior raised his war club high, the polished stone dark and heavy against the sky. Malachi knew his time was up. There would be no explanations, no trial, just the swift, brutal justice of the canyon. Sometimes the truth is a weapon that's turned against you. The war club stopped. It froze in midair, held there not by a physical force, but by a voice. A new voice, deeper than the warriors, calmer than the storm, but carrying a weight of absolute authority that commanded instant obedience. The warrior lowered his weapon, stepping back with a deference that bordered on fear. Through the rain, a new figure emerged. He was older, his movements slow and deliberate, each step radiating a quiet power. He wore no war paint, but the eagle feathers woven into his gray hair and the intricate beadwork on his vest spoke of a status far beyond that of a mere warrior. When Ayanna saw him, her entire body went stiff as a board. She breathed a single word, a word that was equal parts reverence and terror. "Father," the man, Takakota, took in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. He saw his daughter, her clothes in tatters. He saw the white stranger standing in their river, holding a piece of her dress. He saw the circle of warriors, hungry for blood. He saw the truth, or at least the version of it that was presented to him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but it was the calm at the eye of a hurricane. He was asking for an explanation. He was demanding it. Ayanna answered, her voice trembling as she spoke, gesturing at the river, at Malachi, at the torn fabric. Her father listened, his face a stone mask, but his eyes grew darker and harder with every word she spoke. Malachi watched, his stomach twisting into a knot. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't helping. He could see the moment the judgment settled in Takakota's face, a cold, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than the lead warrior's hot-blooded rage. And then Ayana did something strange. She ripped a small leather pouch from her neck and thrust it at her father. Takakota took it, his eyes flicking from the pouch to Malachi, a new, sharp suspicion dawning. He opened it, tipped the contents into his palm, and his entire demeanor changed. The rage didn't vanish, but it shifted its target. He barked a sharp order to his men. Instantly, the warriors broke their circle. Several began to comb the riverbank, their eyes low to the ground, searching for something. Others fanned out, scaling the canyon walls, their gazes sweeping the rocks and trees with a new, urgent purpose. The tension had changed. It was no longer focused entirely on Malachi. "What is it?" Malachi asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "What are they looking for?" To his shock, the chief turned to him. He spoke in English, his accent heavy, but his words as clear and sharp as broken glass. "They look for the men who chased my daughter into the river." The words hit Malachi like a punch to the gut. Men, plural. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't fallen. She had been running. "How many?" Malachi asked, his mind racing. Takakota's eyes narrowed. "You do not know? You were not with them?" "I was tracking cattle," Malachi said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I heard screaming. I found her in the water, that's all." For a long, terrible moment, the chief just stared at him, searching his face, weighing his words. The only sounds were the rain and the rushing water. Finally, Takakota spoke again. "My daughter says you saved her. She also says 3 men on horses ran her to the water's edge, men with yellow hair and pale eyes, like you." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He might be innocent of this one crime, but he was the same kind as those who were guilty. In this place, at this moment, that was enough. A shout came from upstream. One of the searching warriors was holding something up, something that made Takakota's face darken like a thundercloud. It was a piece of cloth, a scrap of a blue shirt, the kind a white man would wear. And as if that discovery was a signal, a new sound began to echo through the canyon. More war cries, not from the warriors already there, but from others, approaching fast, from every direction, from the north, the south, from the ridges above and the valley below. They were pouring in. The entire tribe was coming, and they were all coming for him. When you're surrounded by 200 angry men, your choices get real simple, real fast. The war cries grew from a distant echo to a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very rocks under Malachi's feet. Figures swarmed down the canyon walls, emerging from the trees and the shadows, an unstoppable tide of fury. They moved with a purpose that was terrifying to behold, a river of painted faces and sharpened steel. Takakota's expression had transformed. The anger was still there, but now it was forged into the cold, hard steel of a leader preparing for battle. The small piece of blue cloth had been the spark. Malachi was the tinder. And the whole valley was about to become an inferno. He was the only white man they could see. He was the only target for a rage that had been building for days. 200, Ayana whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost in the noise. "Maybe more. They have been hunting the yellow-haired ones for 3 days. Malachi's blood ran cold. 3 days. This wasn't some random, opportunistic crime. This was part of a larger conflict, a war he had just stumbled into the dead center of. "What did they do?" he asked, needing to understand what had unleashed this level of fury. Ayana glanced at her father, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but then she looked back at Malachi, and the words came tumbling out. "They came to our camp. During the new moon ceremony. They took our sacred objects. They..." They killed 2 of our elders who tried to stop them. Her voice broke on the last words. They said they would be back for more, unless we gave them our land. The story was uglier than he could have imagined. These weren't just thieves. They were killers, profaners. They had struck at the very heart of the tribe, stealing not just valuables, but their connection to their ancestors, to their faith. It was an act of pure evil, designed to wound, to humiliate, to break them. Takakota said something sharp to his daughter, his tone making it clear he didn't approve of her sharing tribal matters with an outsider. But Ayana ignored him, her voice growing stronger, fueled by a defiant anger. I followed them, she said, her chin lifting. I wanted to see where they went, to help our warriors find their trail. But they saw me. They chased me, all the way to the river. So she wasn't just a victim. She was a scout, a warrior in her own right. Her desperation at the riverbank hadn't just been for herself. It had been for her people. Her torn dress was not a mark of shame, but a badge of courage. A courage that was about to get him killed. The warriors kept coming, their numbers seeming endless in the dimming light. Many now carried torches, the flames hissing in the rain, casting a hellish, dancing light on their faces. They formed ranks, sealing the canyon, their movements practiced and precise. They were an army, and he was their prisoner. Takakota raised a hand. The war cries stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was 100 times more terrifying than the noise. In that quiet, Malachi could hear the rain, the river, and the soft, menacing whisper of 200 arrows being notched onto 200 bowstrings. You have 2 choices, white man, Takakota said, his English cold and perfect. Tell us where your yellow-haired brothers have gone, or you will pay for their crimes yourself. Malachi opened his mouth, but the chief cut him off with a slice of his hand. My daughter says you saved her life. For her sake, I give you this one chance. Prove you are not one of them. But if you cannot lead us to the men who spilled our blood... He didn't need to finish. The forest of arrows aimed at Malachi's heart finished the sentence for him. Ayana stepped forward again, positioning herself between Malachi and her father. Her voice was strained, desperate. Father, there is something more. Something I found before they saw me. She reached into a hidden fold in her torn dress, her hand searching for something she had protected through the chase, through the terrifying ordeal in the river. She pulled out a small, dark object. Even in the failing light, Malachi saw the glint of metal. It was a button, a brass button, stamped with the image of an eagle, a United States military button. And in that instant, the entire world shifted on its axis once again. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Sometimes, he's just your only ticket out of a very shallow grave. The brass button sat in Takakota's palm, gleaming under the torchlight. The eagle was unmistakable. Fort Carson, the nearest military outpost, a 3-day ride to the east. The implications sent a shockwave through the assembled warriors. They shifted, their arrows still aimed at Malachi, but their focus was now on that small piece of metal. This wasn't just robbery and murder anymore. If United States soldiers were involved, this was an act of war. A war that would bring the entire U.S. Army down on this canyon, raining fire and death. Where? Takakota's voice was tight, a wire drawn to its breaking point. Near the old oak, Ayana said, where they stopped to argue. It must have fallen from one of their coats. Malachi's mind was spinning. He knew that tree. It marked the edge of tribal lands. It was a crossroads. If they were arguing there, it meant they weren't on a mission. They were lost. Or at least, they were running without a clear destination. They weren't soldiers following orders. They weren't soldiers, Malachi said, the words coming out sharp and certain. Every head snapped toward him. He felt the crushing weight of their attention, the suspicion, the hatred. How do you know this? Takakota demanded. Because I know the man who commands Fort Carson, Colonel Matthews. He's a hard man, but he's an honorable one. He would never order an attack on a ceremony. He would never sanction the murder of elders. Malachi paused, letting the pieces click into place in his own mind. But deserters. Deserters would still have their uniforms. They would have their training. And they would be desperate. It was the only thing that made sense. Deserters would know how to move, how to fight. They would have no chain of command to answer to, no rules to follow. They would be ghosts, operating outside the law of both the white man and the tribe. And they would be dangerous as cornered wolves. There's more, Ayanna said, stepping forward again. When they were arguing, I heard them mention a ship, getting to the coast. A ship. That one word changed the map completely. They weren't heading back to military territory. They were running west, toward California, toward the ocean where they could disappear forever. And to get there, they had to cross settler lands. Lands Malachi knew like the back of his own hand. He knew the trails. He knew the ferrymen. He knew the traders who saw everything and said nothing unless you knew the right questions to ask. I can help you, Malachi said, the offer leaving his lips before he had fully weighed the consequences. I can find them. I know the routes they'll have to take. I know the people they'll have to pass. A heavy silence fell over the canyon. Takakota stared at him, those dark eyes boring into him, trying to see the truth, trying to find the lie. The warriors waited, their bows still drawn, waiting for their chief's command. Kill the white man, or trust him. And why would you do this for us? Takakota asked, his voice laced with a deep, understandable suspicion. Why would you risk your life for our sacred things? Malachi looked at Ayanna. He saw the courage that had led her to follow killers alone in the woods. He saw the strength that had allowed her to tell the truth, even when it put his life in more danger. He saw a debt that needed to be paid. Because what they did was wrong, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. Because your daughter risked her life to tell the truth, and because sometimes the right thing is the only thing. Takakota held his gaze for a long time. Then, he turned to his warriors and spoke in his own tongue. The words were rapid, sharp, authoritative. Malachi watched as, one by one, the bows were lowered. The immediate threat of death receded like an outgoing tide. But when the chief turned back to Malachi, his face was still carved from granite. If you lie, he said, the words a quiet promise of pain. If this is a trick to lead my warriors into a trap, you will pray for a death as quick as an arrow. Malachi met his gaze without flinching. I understand. Good, Takakota said. We ride at dawn, and if we do not find these thieves in 3 days, you will take their place, and your death will not be quick. Dawn was a gray, bitter smear on the horizon. The storm had passed, but the clouds hung low and heavy, trapping the cold in the canyon. Malachi watched Ayanna, who now wore practical leather riding clothes, her long hair braided tight. She moved with a quiet competence, preparing her father's horse for the hard ride ahead. The torn dress was gone, given to an elder woman for mending, a silent promise that their culture would endure this wound. About 50 of the best warriors had been chosen for the chase. They were mounted, armed, and ready, a silent, deadly force waiting for the sun. You know these men, Ayanna said, coming to stand by his small fire. It wasn't a question. Better than you told my father. Malachi looked at her, surprised again by how much she saw. What makes you say that? When my father said the word deserters, your face changed. It was not surprise. It was anger, a personal anger, like you have met men like this before. She was right. There was no point in hiding it now. 3 years ago, he began, his voice low, a group of deserters hit a homestead not 20 miles from my ranch. A family, the Millers, they killed them all. Man, wife, 2 small children, stole their horses and supplies, and vanished. Did you find them? She asked, her own eyes reflecting the fire's light. We tracked them for a week, caught 2 of them. The memory made his jaw ache. The 3rd one got away. The leader, a man named Sergeant Pike. He had yellow hair and pale eyes, and he was the most ruthless, empty-eyed man I have ever seen. Ayana's breath hitched. You think it is him? I'd bet my life on it, Malachi said grimly. Pike always ran with the same 2 men, Jennings and Walsh. They all deserted together after the Miller killings. The army's been hunting them ever since. The knowledge landed like a stone in the pit of his stomach. They weren't just hunting thieves. They were hunting a monster, a known killer who had a 3-year head start on them, a man who would not be taken alive. Takakota strode toward them, his face grim. My scouts have found their trail. They went east through Willow Pass just as you said. He paused, and the look on his face told Malachi the bad news wasn't over. But they are not 3 anymore. How many? Malachi asked, a cold dread creeping up his spine. 6, maybe 7. They met others in the night. The odds had just doubled. 50 warriors against 7 trained soldiers in open country was not a fight anyone wanted, but Takakota's expression held something worse than concern. It held a fresh, raw anger. What is it? Ayana asked, sensing it too. Her father held up a piece of damp folded paper. My scout found this, pinned to a tree. Malachi took it. The handwriting was crude, barely literate, but the message was brutally clear. To the savages following us. We have your trinkets. Come after us, and we will burn them one by one. You have 1 day to turn back. After that, your holy things are firewood. Signed, S. Pike. Pike. It was him. And he knew they were coming. He was taunting them. He was using their own sacred objects as a shield, as a weapon. It was a brilliant, cruel strategy. It forced them into an impossible choice. Give up the chase and accept the desecration, or press on and risk watching their heritage turn to ash. Ayana read the note over his shoulder. It is the same man, she whispered. There is more, Takakota said, his voice like gravel. The scout found signs at their camp. Signs they have been meeting with other groups, other outlaws. Pike is not just running, he is building an army. An army of killers and deserters, united under a man with no conscience, and they were riding straight for them. How long to Willow Pass? Malachi asked, his mind racing. Takakota's smile was a terrifying thing. We can be there by sunset. And as he spoke, every eye turned to the east. On the distant horizon, a thin column of black smoke was beginning to rise against the gray sky. A signal, a threat. Pike wasn't waiting for their decision. He had already started burning their past. The smoke was a lie. As they rode, the black pillar on the horizon grew thicker, a funeral pyre for a tribe's soul. The warriors rode in a grim, furious silence, their faces masks of rage. But the closer they got, the more Malachi studied that smoke, the more something felt wrong. It was too controlled, too thin. Pike wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a man to destroy something he could sell. He's bluffing, Malachi shouted to Takakota, reining his horse in at the top of a ridge that overlooked the valley below. Look at the smoke. That's wet wood, maybe some leather. It's not the artifacts. He's trying to panic us. He's keeping the real treasures. Takakota stared, his experienced eyes narrowing as he read the smoke like a language. From the ridge, they could see the camp. 7 men lounging around a large, smoky fire. And next to them, several large leather bundles, the sacred objects, intact. Why keep them? Ayana asked, her voice a hushed breath. Because he's not a zealot. He's a businessman, Malachi said. Those artifacts are worth a fortune to collectors back east. He's not going to burn his retirement fund. He's just buying time. The whole picture snapped into focus. The smoke, the note. It was all a game. A psychological attack designed to make them retreat, or even better, to charge blindly into a trap. And Pike, arrogant as ever, would never believe they could see through his clever ruse. "Look there," Malachi pointed. "That cluster of rocks. He'll have lookouts. 2, maybe 3 men covering the approaches." Takakota nodded. "My men can get to them without a sound, but that still leaves 4 in the camp." 5, Malachi corrected him instantly. "Pike always keeps 1 man with the horses. That's his escape plan. He'll sacrifice the others to give himself a head start with the loot." As if Malachi had summoned him, a man detached from the group and started walking toward their ridge. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was strolling, carrying a piece of white cloth, a flag of truce. But as the figure grew closer, Malachi felt his blood turn to ice. He recognized the man's swagger, the slight tilt of his head. It was Pike himself. "He's coming to negotiate," Malachi breathed. Pike never put himself in danger unless he was absolutely certain he held all the cards. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the prelude to an execution. He either had reinforcements they couldn't see, or he had another trick up his sleeve. Pike stopped 100 yards out. "Malachi Brookie!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the valley. "I know you're up there! Come on down for a chat!" Every warrior turned to stare at Malachi. The fact that Pike knew his name, knew he was here, meant their pursuit hadn't been as secret as they thought. They had a leak, a traitor. "He knows you," Takakota said, his voice dangerously quiet. The old suspicion was back, sharp and venomous. Before Malachi could answer, Pike yelled again, "Bring the chief and the girl too. I've got a deal for you. It's about those pretty trinkets you seem to want back so badly." "It's a trap," Ayanna said, her hand on her knife. "Of course it's a trap," Malachi agreed. "But it's the only one we've got. It's our only chance to get close." Takakota considered it, his face unreadable. What kind of deal could a murderer possibly offer? Pike seemed to read his mind. "The kind of deal that saves a lot of good men from dying today, Chief," he shouted. "But you better hurry. In 5 minutes, I start with that big, pretty headdress I hear you're so fond of." At the mention of the sacred headdress, a ripple of fury went through the warriors. Takakota's body went rigid. Pike had just crossed a line from which there was no return. He had threatened the heart of their people. In the valley, one of Pike's men casually threw another log on the fire, the smoke billowing up thick and black. The time for strategy was over. The time for talk had run out. Now there was only the cold, hard math of war. They walked down into the valley of the shadow. Malachi, Takakota, and Ayanna. Their weapons were in sight, but not in hand. A fragile show of peace that fooled no one. Pike was waiting, a smug grin plastered on his face. He looked the same as Malachi remembered, pale, cruel eyes that held a deep and disturbing amusement at the world's suffering. "Brookie," Pike drawled, "always turning up like a bad penny, and you must be the chief. Heard all about you." Takakota's face was stone. "Speak your deal, thief." "Straight to it. I like that." Pike chuckled. "It's simple. I've got your toys. You've got my freedom. You let me and my men ride out of here, head for the coast, no hard feelings. And in return—" "In return what?" Malachi pressed. "I give you half of them back," Pike said, his grin widening. "The less valuable half, of course. A man's got to have a retirement plan. It's a good deal, Chief. You get some of your junk back, I get to live. Everybody wins." "Except for the family you butchered 3 years ago," Malachi said, his voice dangerously low. "Except for the elders your men shot in the back. They don't win." Pike just shrugged. "Business expenses. We're talking about the future now." Takakota took a step forward, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the air from the valley. "There is no deal. There is no negotiation. You will return what you have stolen, and you will surrender. Your deaths will be quick. That is the only mercy you will be shown. See, that's where you're wrong, Pike said, his smile finally vanishing. His hand drifted casually toward the pistol on his hip. Because I've got an insurance policy. He let out a short, sharp whistle. From the rocks all around them came the unmistakable, chilling sound of rifle hammers clicking back. Not 2 or 3, a dozen at least. They had walked right into the kill box. Pike's men were hidden everywhere, a perfect crossfire. But Pike had made one fatal mistake. He assumed he was the only one who set traps. He underestimated Malachi's hatred. He underestimated a father's rage. Takakota showed no surprise. He simply raised his own hand and gave a sharp, piercing whistle in reply. The response was not sound, but movement. From the earth itself, it seemed, his warriors rose. They hadn't just flanked Pike's lookouts. They had flanked his ambushers. They had spent the last hour like ghosts, using generations of knowledge to move unseen through their own lands, getting above and behind Pike's riflemen. The ambushers were now the ambushed. The hunters were now the prey. Every one of Pike's men found himself looking down the razor-sharp tip of a drawn arrow. The standoff was now absolute. Pike's smug confidence finally shattered. For the first time, Malachi saw fear in his eyes. "Your move, Pike," Malachi said, "but before you make it, you should know. We found your informant." Pike went pale. "What informant?" "Tommy Chen," Malachi said, pulling the name out of thin air, a desperate gamble. "The traitor. Been playing both sides for months. We found him. He won't be helping you anymore." It was a complete bluff, but Pike's face told him it had landed. "Chen, sold me out?" Pike stammered, his mind clearly reeling. "Chen is dead," Takakota said, his voice flat and final. "He talked before he died." Pike's shoulders slumped. His network, his advantage, his entire plan had just evaporated. He was just another outlaw, trapped, with nowhere left to run. "Last chance, Pike," Malachi said. "Surrender, or die here." Pike looked around at the arrows, at the stony faces of the warriors. His eyes darted, calculating, searching for an escape that wasn't there. For a split second, Malachi thought he might give up. Then his hand flashed toward his gun. He was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. Takakota moved like lightning. His war club whistled through the air, connecting with Pike's temple with a sickening, wet crack. Pike crumpled to the ground without a sound, his pistol falling unfired into the dust. Seeing their leader fall, the hidden riflemen panicked, but there was nowhere for them to go. The rustle of struggle from the rocks was brief. The warriors were brutally efficient. When the silence returned, 7 men were dead or captured. And by the dying fire, the leather bundles containing the sacred objects sat, untouched, gleaming in the new sun that was finally breaking through the clouds. Takakota knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the bundles, his hard face softening with profound relief as he confirmed everything was there. "It is all here," he breathed. "All of it." Ayana came to stand beside Malachi. "You knew," she said, her eyes shining. "You knew he was bluffing." "Pike was a lot of things," Malachi said, looking down at the man who had haunted him for 3 years. "But he was never a man to burn money." Takakota stood and faced him. "Malachi Brookie, you have earned our trust. You prevented a war and restored our soul. This is a debt we can never fully repay." Malachi looked at the chief, at his brave daughter, at the warriors respectfully gathering their sacred items. "Let there be peace," he said. "Let today be remembered as the day we chose justice over vengeance." Takakota nodded, a solemn vow passing between them. "It will be so. You will always have a place of honor among us." As they prepared to leave, Ayana touched his arm. "Will we see you again?" "When you need a friend," Malachi said with a small smile, "you'll know where to find me." He watched them go, a procession of honor carrying their history home. The valley was quiet now, the smoke gone, the threat extinguished. Justice had been done. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the untamed West. And if you have a story of an unlikely alliance, share it in the comments below. We read every single one. Your support helps us keep these legends alive.